Good evening, everyone. My name is Candace, and I'm an event manager. On behalf of Town Hall Seattle, the Northwest African American Museum, and Elliott Bay Book Company, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's virtual presentation with Annette Gordon-Reed and Marcus Harrison Green as part of our Civic Series. As we get underway, I would like to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continued use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. Thank you for tuning in. Town Hall is proud to be a community-focused organization and a place where we can share and sustain ideas and creativity, even if it means we can't gather in person. I'd like to thank Professor Gordon-Reed and Marcus for appearing tonight to help make that possible. If you share in Town Hall's vision for a robust community engaged in the arts, science, and culture, where everyone has a voice, please consider donating or becoming a member. Town Hall is adding new programs every day. Upcoming programs include Sasha Eisenberg and Aditi Roy, who join us to chronicle the 25-year struggle over marriage equality in America. M. Leona Godin discusses a personal and cultural history of blindness, and Omar Engarcion talks with Christiana Obey Sumner to make the case for gay reparations. You can check out more of what's upcoming by visiting our online calendar at townhallseattle.org. Tonight's conversation will be about an hour, including Q&A. Questions will be selected from those in the chat field at the bottom of the video player, so you can submit those at any time. You can also text questions to 206-504-2857 as noted in the chat. We can't guarantee that we'll get to every question, but we will try to get to as many as possible. Please keep your questions concise and in the form of a question. For those who would like to view the program with closed captioning, you can click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player, and the program will be available for rewatching immediately following the event. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Civic Series is supported by Real Networks Foundation, True Brown Foundation, KUOW, the Northcliffe Foundation, and Wyncote Foundation Northwest. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of our members watching. One final note, you will want to dive deeper into tonight's conversation by purchasing a copy of On Juneteenth, so please use the link in the chat to purchase through Elliott Bay Book Company. And now for this evening's program, we are honored to have Lanisha DeBartoleben, President and CEO of the Northwest African American Museum, with us here tonight to offer a welcome and introduce our guests. Please join me in welcoming Lanisha DeBartoleben.
Thank you, Candace. Hello and welcome to tonight's Juneteenth program. We are delighted to present this program in partnership with Town Hall Seattle and Elliott Bay Book Company. I'm Lanisha DeBartoleben. This is Juneteenth week, and the Northwest African American Museum is committed to honoring the ancestors who learned of their freedom 2.5 years too late. We are dedicated to commemorating this cultural holiday with hope and healing for our community. This year, our museum helped make Juneteenth become a statewide holiday in Washington State. Also, in alignment with Juneteenth, our museum has launched our own choir called the African American Cultural Ensemble, which will debut on tomorrow during our virtual Lift Every Voice program in commemoration with 9 other African American museums from across the country. In fact, the Northwest African American Museum is hosting for the first time 9 days of Juneteenth activities this year, all sponsored by Amazon. It kicked off on yesterday with an interactive story time for children and families, featuring Seattle Sounders former player Steve Zakawani reading a children's book, while Black artist Teddy Stat Phillips led an interactive children's art session. And for the rest of this week, we will have activities that will engage, inspire, and inform our community about this important history. There's programming for everyone this Juneteenth week with the Northwest African American Museum, including a Juneteenth Youth Night on Thursday, celebrating all Black graduates from pre-K through college at Lumen Field North parking lot in drive-in graduation fashion. We'll also host a major Juneteenth jamboree on Saturday, June 19, at Judkins Park in the Central District, featuring live performances, live story time, knowledge is power, book giveaways, COVID-19 vaccinations, blood pressure screenings, mental health tools, horseback rides from Seattle's Buffalo Soldiers, food, music, and participation from all 5 of Seattle's professional sports teams: Seattle Seahawks, the Sounders, the Storm, the Mariners, the Kraken, and so much more. NAM's Juneteenth Jamboree will definitely be something you won't want to miss. Judkins Park on June 19th. So be sure to visit NAM's website for all Juneteenth week daily details. And tonight, Town Hall, Elliott Bay Book Company, and the Northwest African American Museum are delighted to have Annette Gordon-Reed with us to discuss her book, On Juneteenth. Annette Gordon-Reed is the Carl M. Loeb University Professor at Harvard University. She has won 16 book prizes, including the Pulitzer Prize in History and the National Book Award for her book, The Hemmings of Monticello, An American Family. Her other works include a book entitled Race on Trial, Law and Justice in American History. She has served as national president for the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic, and she is current president of the Ames Foundation. A selected list of her honors include a Guggenheim Fellowship in the Humanities, a MacArthur Fellowship, the National Humanities Medal, and the Frederick Douglass Book Prize. In conversation with Professor Gordon-Reed tonight is Marcus Harrison Green, highly respected and highly beloved founder and publisher of the South Seattle Emerald, and a columnist with Crosscut. He was named one of Seattle's most influential people by Seattle Magazine in 2016. When he speaks, we listen. When he writes, we read. And we are so grateful for his leadership. And so I am delighted to pass this conversation now to Marcus Harrison Green, who will be in conversation with Professor Annette Gordon-Reed. Enjoy, and thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Lanisha, and thank you so much for Town Hall for having us today. It is such a privilege to be here. I got to say, as Lanisha was reading off of all of Professor Gordon-Reed's achievements, I was like, man, did she invent the Nike Swish too? It's so much. And I just want to throw out there too that I was a former columnist for Crosscut, and I'm a current columnist for the Seattle Times. And so I know my editor was watching, and I did not want her to to be in anger. So my bad, Lanisha, but thank you very much. That being said, Professor Gordon-Reed, it is such a tremendous pleasure to be here with you today. I know that even though it's virtually, this is seriously a privilege. And I know that I want to say yesterday, I believe you were at the Dartmouth commencement, Dartmouth graduation. And I got to say that as far as I know, most of the town hall participants and attendees are fairly bright as well. So you are in very good company.
Glad to be here.
Thank you. Well, I just want to start off by saying this is just a tremendous work. And I've read it twice. Once was to, just for fun, so to speak. And the second one was really to absorb many of the historical lessons and just the wisdom in this book, to my soul. And this was such a pleasure to read. And I actually want to start our discussion today with one of my favorite passages from your book. It's on page 55 in the Queen Gordon-Reed version, as I'll say it today. It starts with, origin stories matter for individuals, groups of people, and for nations. They inform our sense of self, telling us what kind of people we believe we are, what kind of nation we believe we live in. They usually carry at least a hope that where we started might hold the key to where we are in the present. We can say then that much of the concern with origin stories is about our current needs and desires, usually to feel good about ourselves, not actual history. History is about people and events in a particular setting and context, and how those things have changed over time in ways that make the past different from our own time, with an understanding that those changes were not inevitable. Origin stories often seek to find the familiar or the superficially familiar, memory, sometimes shading into mythology. Both memory and mythology have their uses, even if they must be separated from our understandings about the demands of historical thinking. So one, that was some brilliance right there, but I wanted to lead into my question here. So we do know that, yes, legal chattel slavery officially ended with the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 8th, 1865, excuse me, December 6th, 1865. But you're the historian, so I know you were going to correct me on that. But Juneteenth has come to obviously commemorate the end of slavery in the United States for many folks, when Union Major General Gordon Granger, while stationed in Texas, made the delayed announcement that slavery was over on June 19th, 1865. So we do know that Juneteenth's modern day significance goes beyond just that one moment in that one city in Texas. Here in Washington State, it's an official holiday. There'll be celebrations across the country on Saturday, across the city at everywhere from Jenkins Park to Jimi Hendrix Park to Skyway Park to Rainier Beach to where have you across our city here. As we sit here today, you're a decorated historian, scholar, Texan member of the Black community, American. What significance does Juneteenth hold for you today?
Well, the significance to me is as a time for us to reflect upon, to think back on the feelings of the people at the time who learned that they were no longer going to be treated as property. All of the kinds of things that go with that, being sold, being given away as gifts, being treated as things, as instruments of other people, that would go away. And we need to pause and think about that and think about what that meant to them and the hopes they had at that time, even though we understand what's going to happen, that there was still going to be a struggle afterwards. But the legacy of that, bringing that all together, it's a way of connecting us to the past and to our present. So that's the significance for it for me, to sort of pause and think about this moment that's not just a Texas story or United States story. It's a story in world history, in the advance of human rights. It's been a struggle, it's a journey, but that was one step on the way. And we should commemorate, we should remember all of those things at times when human beings make an advancement in human society.
Absolutely. Well, I don't want to read from your book all night, even though I got to tell you, as a writer myself, I was very jealous of many of the passages in here. I kept saying to to myself, I wish I would have, written this. I don't know what deal you made with the devil to write this well, but whatever it is, let me in on it, please. But despite the title, this tremendous book is very much a memoir, not only of your personal journey growing up in Texas, but also the residue of the toxic myths that continue to attack and be pervasive through our society. And so I'd actually like to read an excerpt from the book that for me certainly exemplifies that. And if people happen to have their books at home, it's on page 26, but it says, and to your point about Texas, it says, all the major currents of American history flow through Texas. As big as it is, that is still a lot for any one state to handle. There is little wonder why the cowboy would be picked at the most representative figure. Divorced from plantation slavery, coming from a part of the state relatively devoid of Black people, the image of the cowboy on the range quiets the noise a bit and avoids the tragic element in Texas history, the element that Juneteenth supposedly closed the door on, even as it opened another tragic phase in the state and country's history. As painful as it may be, recognizing, though not dwelling on, tragedy, and the role it plays in our individual lives and in the life of a state or nation is, I think, a sign of maturity. You go on then to say that the past is dead, but like other formerly living things, echoes of the past remain, leaving their traces in the people and events of the present and future. I think you're countering William Faulkner there, I want to say, when you say
Yeah, yes. I mean, it's, yeah. And I say that, because I see that quote everywhere all the time, and I know what he's getting at, but he's getting at a couple of things. Number one, he's making what he thinks is a profound statement about it, but it really is white Southerners' disinclination to move on from their past. It's almost a lost cause. I don't like the lost cause implications of that. And reality, I think there's a way to think about, in reality, there's a way to think about the way the past influences our time without saying that we have to be stuck there, because we're not. I mean, we don't have to be stuck there, but we have to be mindful of it and understand that it influences us. But to say that this continues is to say that the Southern way of life, the Southern values of that time are timeless. And, that means that Black people's subordination and white supremacy are timeless, and they don't have to be. So that's what I was getting at there, to sort of recognize the truth in what he says, but for people not to take him too seriously, because there's a purpose here, and that purpose is feeding into a mythology that we're still trying to work away from, and that is the lost cause, the glorious South, the honorable South, that defeated South, the romantic vision of all of that stuff that was such a nightmare for African American people.
Right. Well, I don't want to, as a fan of more of Hemingway than Faulkner, I don't want to dog Faulkner too much now.
No, I mean, he's a great writer, but but he did have that kind of Southern, sort of romanticism about the war and about what losing meant, and it's the romance of that kind of the failure, but not thinking about the future, that in fact we recognize the past, but we move on. We do make changes.
Yeah, I absolutely loved your quote, and honestly that response to Faulkner, because I want to say that particular quote of his is seemingly stood the test of time. So I'm glad that it was finally challenged. That being said, I do want to ask, because that you obviously talk about the sort of outsized role of Texas in the history of our modern day United States in terms of its configuration. I wanted to ask you, in your estimation, why does Texas play such an extraordinary role in the history of this country in terms of how it shaped our modern society?
Well, because there's so many parts of the American story there. You have the conflict between Europeans and indigenous people. You have plantation slavery, and westward expansion. You have the conflict between Anglo culture and Latino culture. Texas borders, a foreign country, so immigration is a problem. And then you had Jim Crow after the end of plantation slavery. There's no other state that has all of those attributes, and all of those things have been at one point or another problems or issues for the United States. And Texas, unlike many other places, Texas didn't have to become diverse. It was always diverse. It starts out with different people, different colors, different ethnicities, different languages, different religions, all in one place. So it's not a journey towards diversity. It's always been there. And so that makes it very American, even though in some ways I know people from outside of Texas see Texas as exotic, as sort of weird. And I will admit in some ways it is, but the truth is it's sort of America in microcosm there. And that's what makes it, makes it such a very volatile place, I think. And dealing with all those extremes, dealing with all those currents in one place makes it tough sometimes, but I think it gives it great potential too. And that when I talk in the book about hopes for a place, the hope is that it could realize its potential and bring all those forces together for good rather than for turmoil.
Right, right. Well, and keeping on Texas for a bit here, I was actually surprised to read that you took you first sort of took offense initially to other states outside of Texas observing Juneteenth. Why was that? Other than, I mean, I have an aunt and uncle who live in Texas, so I definitely know that they are, proud Texans and and proud to claim anything as Texas. So
Yeah. Well, this was more or less when I was in college. This was a while back because I just felt I'd grown up thinking that this was a holiday for Black Texans, even in particular Black Texans, that this was sort of our holiday. And it made us special and it made us unique. And then when I went out and found out that other people were celebrating it, of course, I hadn't thought about the fact that as Texans moved away from Texas, people went out west most often to California and to Arizona and some other parts of the United States to the east. They took the holiday with them and said, we used to celebrate this, and so now we're going to celebrate it here. So the diaspora, the Black Texas diaspora, spread the holiday around the country. And that was really just a short amount of time that I felt that. Then I felt it makes sense because for the reason I said before, this is a milestone, that this is an important thing, not just for Texas, not just for the United States, but in human history. The end of treating people like property. Anytime, emancipation is a process, obviously. You mentioned the end of the ratification of the 13th Amendment, the Emancipation Proclamation, enslaved people themselves, freeing themselves by running away from the plantation once the chaos of war. They saw that as an opportunity and they left in droves. And, so to have a day like that where people celebrate those moments, bring them all together. And don't just talk about Juneteenth, but talk about the 13th Amendment, talk about when Richmond falls. I think they celebrate that in Virginia, April 3rd or something like that, to bring those days together to talk about the process of emancipation. And then I realized, this belongs to everybody and there's no reason to be, stingy about it or to think that it should be held to us alone. We should be glad that people are willing to celebrate together.
Yeah. So I want to ask you, because I know there's, I know there's different thoughts on the celebration of Juneteenth in terms of, all right, whose holiday it is, and it's. I know you fall into the camp that it's very much an American holiday.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about why you feel that? Just a little bit more about why you feel that, I should say.
That it's an American holiday? Well, because it changed life in America. Texas is the largest state, was the largest state in the Union. It was the most difficult state in some ways to subdue, to get things going there in terms of, after the end of the war and with Reconstruction. There was a lot of recalcitrance there. But I think when you make a connection to places that we have a system of federalism where we have 50 states and the federal government over it, but we are one nation, and celebrating the triumphs, celebrating the freedom of a group of people who were the last. This is sort of the last people who benefited from the efforts of the Army of the United States of America, because the reason it took so long for this to take place was that the Army of the Trans-Mississippi kept fighting. Most people think the Civil War was over, all the conflicts were over when Lee surrendered at Appomattox in April of 1865, but they kept fighting. And the last battle of the Civil War was in Texas, and ironically, the Confederates won, but they realized at that point that there was no going forward. So this is the end of an armed conflict and I think it's really important that Black men who enlisted in the Army of the United States helped to bring to an end. And they are there in Galveston. liberating Galveston, that celebrating the end of the Confederacy's armed effort to maintain that system is something that all Americans ought to be happy about and to join in with. So, because it's not just the end of an idea, a pernicious idea, the defeat of it at the hands of Black and white troops. And you see that with Granger in Galveston, with Black troops and people making this announcement, and what that must have felt like to people who felt liberated. That's something for all Americans to share.
Amen. Amen. So in reading your book, it was interesting that, I shouldn't say it was interesting, it was one of those things that was shocking but not surprising, where, in my youth, my elementary and high school education, and I was a kid who went to private school. My parents worked 2 jobs apiece to afford to do that. But I will say that Juneteenth was certainly omitted from my education. And there are quite a few others, quite a few other incidents that you mark in this book that were certainly not discussed. And so I want to ask you, as a historian, as an educator, are you hopeful that the history you talk about in this book can be routinely taught, given the backlash that we're seeing currently to a lot of the curriculum that shines a light on how race played such a role in forming this country?
I'm hopeful about that. I think the reason that some of this legislation is coming up is a backlash against how far we've come. I think in talking about these issues in school, I would say that, my kids, and from what I've been able to see of the kinds of literature that's available to young people today that wasn't available when I was a kid, is that they're getting more of the lesson. They're getting more opportunities to learn about things that we're different generations, but that I certainly didn't get a chance to know from my school, from my schooling. Fortunately, my parents were well read, and we always had magazines and we had books in the house. And so, I had access to a lot of things that maybe others did not. But I think even today, there's more openness about this kind of thing. And I think that this is a reaction to it, the kind of measures that we're seeing. There will be a fight about it. Just because people are proposing this doesn't mean that everybody's just going to roll over and not teach things that are just part of primary documents. I mean, if you're talking about the Republic of Texas, and there's something called the Project 1836, which is the year that Texas became a republic, and it's supposed to foster patriotic education and so forth. But the Texas Constitution talks explicitly about slavery and justifying slavery and protecting slavery. And it says, that people of African descent can't become citizens, they can't migrate to the state and live without permission, all those kinds of things. I mean, there's no way to get around that if you're going to teach about history, and if you give students primary documents. I think the primary documents, more than textbooks. With textbooks, you have the option of people editing things out. But if you give students the primary documents, they tell the story themselves. I mean, we didn't just invent talking about race now. Everybody says this is some sort of like some newfangled thing that we're kind of foisting on everybody. But people in the 18th century and the 19th century talked about race all the time. They passed laws about it. They had court cases about it. They had constitutions that talked about it, legislation that talked about it. So, I think there are ways, and I think that teachers who are creative will get around it. It's a shame they have to get around stuff. But I do think that these movements are part of a backlash against the greater openness about questions of race and sexism, all kinds of isms that afflicted the past.
Right. So it may not be a straight line trajectory, but it's trending upward.
Yeah, I mean, it's a struggle. All of these things we've had this stuff before. There are always people who want to ban books or want to do things, to limit education. But, yeah, in the end, I do think that the push is always will be towards greater openness about these things, because I just don't see any reason to believe that people are just going to stop in their tracks and talking about what's true.
Right. Well, speaking about what's true and what's not,
Mhm.
in the book, you talk about how much of the accepted teaching of American slavery and the history of those of African descent on this North American continent limited the imaginative possibilities of Blackness.
Mhm.
Essentially, what could be done by people in that skin.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Mhm. Well, I discussed this in the chapter in which I'm talking about the first person of African descent that we know of by name. There probably were others, and I know there were others certainly after him or during the same time. Estebanica,
Right.
who
It
came
predates the
to
1619.
who came to North America in the area that was first what we would consider to be Florida, and then to Texas in the area that we consider to be Texas, in the 1500s, in the 1520s. And he's with the most famous person. He didn't come specifically with him, but the most famous person who was in this expedition and with whom he ends up after everybody is, killed off and dies, down from hundreds of people down to 4 people. Cabeza de Vaca is a name that probably most people know in America. That's one of the explorers that we learned growing up. And he ends up with Cabeza de Vaca, enslaved by some indigenous people when they get shipwrecked off of near Galveston in that area, that general area. They end up walking across Texas and Mexico, almost reaching the Pacific Ocean, but get to the Pacific seaboard here, essentially. And over a process of years, and during this time period, he serves as an interpreter sometimes between the native peoples and the Europeans. And I just was saying, I reflect in the book on the fact that I heard about Esteban. We called him Esteban. That's the name they used, but sort of in passing. And I just thought about what if they had told the stories about, his serving as a translator, about his history, that there were other people of African descent who came with the Spanish, who some were enslaved, some were not, some left the expeditions and struck out on their own. And the genetics of that area, gene pool of that area tells that there were African influences in the area that was Texas, Mexico, Central America. If we knew that enslaved people or people who were from Africa were all over the world doing all kinds of things, not just working on plantations, that it opens up, or serving as translators, it opens up your understanding of these people, making you realize, we know it, but driving home the point that these were human beings and who did a variety of things, that the notion of Blackness as inherently limiting would, you could counter that notion if you just had these kinds of examples. But we didn't talk about slavery very much at all when I was growing up. But when we did, it was always, there were people who worked in the fields and there were people who worked in the house. And that was pretty much that ran the gamut of all of the experiences of Black people. And that just wasn't true.
Right. I actually want to follow that up because you, later in the book, you talk about the great sociologist, W.B. Du Bois. And you talk about Blackness and Americanness and how they've been cast in opposition to one another, a predicament created by the details of history and the desires of others. What has it meant for Blacks to claim Americanness while substantial numbers, you're saying this in the book, what has it meant for Blacks to claim Americanness while substantial numbers of their fellow Americans reject the ideas that Blacks can be true Americans? And that they have used their great numbers to make that rejection the basis of law and social policy. in our current day, we're seeing that play out in our voter suppression laws in places, well, like Texas and some other areas. How do we fight against this? How do we look at potentially lessons from our past that can help us combat some of this stuff that is going on in our modern day?
Well, we fight against it the way we always have. I mean, whatever political tools, whatever legal tools, we've been at this a very, very long time, since the Declaration, with people filing petitions for freedom suits, sometimes successfully, not sometimes successful, agitation, making common cause with allies who were willing to take up the cause and fight together for it, whether abolitionists. We did it when the war broke out and Black soldiers enlisted and fought, and when enslaved people left the plantation. I mean, we know how to do this. One of the things that Du Bois says, another thing he says, and many things that he said were valuable things, is that African-American people, he would have said the American Negro, had a special message for the world because of the things that have happened to us. We've learned a lot about struggle. We've learned about resistance. We've learned how to operate under circumstances that seem against us. And we've been successful. I mean, the fact that it's not perfect doesn't mean that, and I don't even doesn't perfect, it's not where we want it to be, doesn't mean that there have not been successes. There have been. And I don't want to dishonor the efforts of the people in the past who worked to make those changes. But we know how to do this. And whatever is thrown before us, we find a way to adjust and make advancements. And I think we'll do that now. I mean, we do have allies. We've always had people who've been willing to join in and to join the struggle and the fight for that. But we'll keep doing it. I mean, politically, organizing politically, voting, agitating, protesting, making the persuasion, all those kinds of tools we've used before, we'll use them again.
Yes, let's hope. Certainly hope. There's a couple of images in your book that I haven't been able to get out of my head since I read it the first time, and thankfully this is a historical, is obviously a book about history, and so I'm not spoiling any endings here. But you talk about how white people in Texas, is after the original announcement of slavery's end, how many were incensed after that announcement, and they acted violently to just the Black jubilation that was on display from so many Black folks, just so happy to be free. And you later contrast that with many Black Texans who, in the face of all this hostility around them, and it was a ton, who just went about the business of making new lives for themselves. And when they easily could have sought vengeance and released carnage, and yet they did not. And I got to say that when I read those passages, I couldn't help but think, about the insurrection at the Capitol, obviously on January 6th, and then all the majority, peaceful protests, that happened in the face of that murder of that happened of George Floyd, obviously, and so many others. And yet, we're 155 years removed from the announcement on June 19th, 1865, 55, or longer than 155 years, I should say. But that hostility, right, to recognizing someone's full humanity and equal measures of freedom and democracy are still very much alive today. And so, I mean, how do we kill that, right? I mean, how does the lessons that we can take potentially from Juneteenth, how can we potentially effectively, snuff those fires or those embers of hatred out? Can we?
Well, but I don't think we can. All we can do is, what we can do. We can persuade, as I said, work with allies. I really think that we're at a point, and there comes a point when it's white people who consider themselves to be our allies who have to talk to deal with members of their community who live by hate or who feel that it's a zero-sum game, that Black people's advancement means the destruction of white people, which it doesn't. It's not a zero-sum game. I don't really think that we can, and we shouldn't be, I think, in the position of trying to talk anybody into believing that we're people. We don't have to do that. The main thing is for us to sort of build our communities, build our families, build our understandings of, the necessity to keep going forward, and work with whites who are allies. And they have in the past, some in the past have persuaded members of their community to come along. But I don't, I'm an optimistic person, but I'm not optimistic about that. This is the notion of a racial hierarchy that slavery helped to create, white supremacy, notions of white supremacy. Those are deeply ingrained in people. And it's not, I would never say it's a hopeless situation, but I don't think that we should take it upon ourselves to think that we are going to solve that problem. That's a problem that whites in their culture have to work on, and they have been working on it. That's what happened in the civil rights movement in the South. There were Southern whites who said, whatever it is I'm getting out of this, it's not worth it for me to treat people like this or to see people treated this way. And they made common cause. But that's what you have to hope for. But I don't know how you rid other people of their hatred. You just have to go forth in faith yourself in our capacities and our abilities to move forward along with allies and hope for the best. I don't think that people have to come to that on their own, you can't make people feel certain ways. They have to, and they say this about people who are addicted to things, that you may want the person to, it's not gonna work until they decide themselves, this is enough.
Right.
This is enough.
Right. I heard it said once that there is definitely a distinction between an optimist and a delusionalness. And thank you for sharing that, marking that distinction. I do want to turn to a story in your book about a man named Bob White. He was a black man who lived in Livingston, Texas. He was accused of raping a white woman, Ruby Cochran, and he was later beaten into a confession. Eventually, the United States Supreme Court ruled that he should be retried. During that retrial, Ruby Cochran's husband shot Bob in the back of the head and killed him. Now, the man ended up getting off for the death of Bob White. You write, it's a gruesome spectacle of murder to send a message, during post-slavery and Reconstruction. And you use that story to, in the context of the book, to talk about some of the history, the sort of, I guess you could say, an inconvenient history, if you will, that it is erased many times from what we learn. And you go on to write that, what is the morality that would say that the oppressor's version of historical events should take precedence over the knowledge of the oppressed? Now, I know we've been dealing with some pretty heavy stuff, and I don't mean to dwell on tragedy at all, but I do want to ask you, how can we get to a point where we can collectively reject a sanitized version of history? And there's so many people who say the reason that Americans don't speak the truth more is that many of us can't agree on what the truth actually is.
Well, and because this is a young country. And I was talking to a scholar of Latin American history, and we were saying that, he was suggesting, and I agreed with him, that Americans fixate on, people in the Americas, North and South America, fixate on founders and the foundings of their country so much because it's so close to us. And because it's so close to us, the issues are really raw. You know, it's very, there's some groups of people want to believe that their great grandparents were all good and, you know, did only good things, and don't want to and feel guilty when you point out, yes, but you do know that they had this system of slavery, or there was, you know, they removed native peoples. I mean, all those kinds of things. And they did good things as well, but they did bad things, and people don't want to face that. And so it's very hard to talk about issues when you don't, when people don't want to recognize a truth, or the truth is something that's painful to them, and they feel that you're accusing them when you bring these things up, but they happen. You know, the Bob White situation. My grandfather told me about that story when I was a kid, and it wasn't until I wrote this book that I realized, that I found out that case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. I thought that was just, I knew that was just sort of a local story that happened, and but it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And, you know, I teach criminal procedure. And when I talk about coerced confessions and the Supreme Court's adoption of the due process clause as a standard for judging confessions, I use Brown versus Mississippi. I could have been using this case that I have known about since I was 8 or 9 years old, but didn't realize it didn't know about the procedural history until I saw it. Well, you know, that is real stuff. And I'm sure that there are people in the town who might not be happy about me raising this story again, because it reflects badly on the town. But there is no way to understand Conroe, to understand that part of Texas, without talking about those issues. There were good things that happened, but there were horrific things that happened, because those kinds of things live in the memories of people. You know, this happened, the court case this is 1940. And, you know, I'm talking about the mid 60s when I'm integrating my town schools. Some of those people were still alive. You know, some of the people, their children were alive. All of that influenced the way people acted towards one another. It is a ripple effect that goes throughout the society, waves and currents that just keep coming back. So it's very unpleasant for people to think about these kinds of things, but you realize that this history is just so close to us that you can't ignore it.
Yes, and speaking of, I mean, you certainly, you know, many times throughout the book, you caution against idolizing any human being.
Yes.
You wrote another brilliant, in your brilliant prose, you say, people want the individuals from the past they admire to be right on the question of race, no matter how wrong they actually were. So that admiring such people poses no problem. Difficulty is that not many European Americans in the 18th and 19th century were what we would consider to be right on the question of race, which at a minimum requires believing in the equal humanity of African Americans. Now, obviously, there continues to be, you know, debate around, you know, what we do with some folks who are supposedly were on the good side, if you will, of the Civil War, and then also those founders of the country, like the Thomas Jeffersons, who you wrote extensively about, it should be said, and the George Washingtons of the world, and so forth. What do you think we should do as a country to just have, quite frankly, more complexity around, you know, these heroes? I mean, these quote unquote national heroes. Is it that we should potentially have a more sophisticated view of human nature? I mean, not to idolize at all ancient Greek culture or anything, but, right? I mean, their heroes were very much, you know, extremely flawed, to be honest, and very complex. And it was always an inner war in however they would present their heroes. Very much an inner war between the good and evil and inside the person. How do we sort of get to a more nuanced view, if you will?
Well, I think we're on the way to doing it. This is messy right now, but we're on the way to doing it. I mean, think about the difference between what people will tell you going to Monticello 30 years ago and going to Monticello today, where people talk about all aspects of slavery at Monticello. They talk about the good things about Jefferson, the Declaration, all of that, but they talk about the problematic things, the bad things. And so I think we're in the midst of that and we don't see it yet. It makes it all very uncomfortable to people now as we're grappling with this. But I think we're in the process of moving forward. That's again, the reason for the reactions, that, we're moving in a direction where people, I hope, will be able to think of people in the past with less of a tendency to idolize people, because it doesn't really do them, as a historian, I know it doesn't really do them justice, that these are people who had good points and bad points, who had struggles, who had issues that, you're not dealing with forthrightly if you make them plaster saints. You don't really know them. You don't really know. I mean, for historians, it's always about you're trying as near as you can, if you're writing about people, to figure out what that person thought he or she was doing in the world. Why were they doing these things? But if you just come at them with your preset notions about their heroism or their greatness or whatever, you really don't get to know that person. So my answer is, I really do think that we're in the process of moving forward with, as you said, a more sophisticated understanding, just in the way you do, you like little kids idolize their parents, and then you grow up and you realize, especially if you have kids, you realize you don't know what you're doing. They didn't really know what they were doing. They were doing the best that they could during that time period, but you're able to see them as people and appreciate them in some ways, definitely appreciate them even more when you realize the courage that it took for them to move in the world. And so, yeah, I think we're in the process of having a more detached and more realistic understanding of founders. And I think we're at the stage, because we're still a young country, we're still idolizing people, or we were for the longest time in that mode of doing that, and we're moving out of it. And I think it'll be for the better.
So wait a minute, Professor Gordon-Reed, you're saying that 100 years from now, if somebody's talking about you and I, they might not look at us as perfect?
Yeah, they might, believe it or not.
Okay, well,
they might not.
I'll have to sit with that.
I don't see how.
No. Well, I do want to get into some of the audience questions here from our town hall audience. One of the questions says, what were the factors that kept the news of who had won the war and that slavery is over from getting to Texas?
Well, the factors was the main factor was the Confederate Army. The Army of the Trans-Mississippi kept fighting. And so it's not so much that people didn't know about the Emancipation Proclamation, it's that they didn't have control of the territory. This was about, I mean, we sometimes forget that this is a war. There are battles here. And Lee, and as I said, we fixate on Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, which was the most important army, but the army out west kept fighting. And as long as they were fighting and they didn't surrender, and the United States Army did not have control of that territory, you could know that they're supposed to be free, but until they came under the control of the army, that they couldn't make that a reality. As it turns out, and I say this in the book, Black people in Galveston knew before Granger got there what was going to happen, because there are accounts of people celebrating, and people are saying, why are you celebrating? And they said, because we're free. So, I mean, and temporally, this is closer to Granger, and the question is more about those 2-year periods. But the 2-year period is a period when there's still fighting going on in the territory, and they didn't take control of it until the beginning of June. The Army of the Trans-Mississippi surrenders.
Got it. The other question says, why do you think that Juneteenth is really coming to people's consciousness now? Have there been attempts to make it a national holiday before?
There have been attempts to make it a national holiday before. I think last year it came within one vote or something like that. They're trying it again. I think the theories that I've heard, because I noticed in the last 5 years much more attention to it, and last year apparently there was sort of a peak of interest in it. And some people suggest that it was because it's around the time of the George Floyd murder. As people were thinking about race and we're having a reckoning on race, you have a holiday that talks about freedom and slavery, which invites you to think about the legacies of slavery and race, the way the institution shaped people's attitudes about race. And so I think it was that the suggestion is that people were trying to find a way to have that discussion, to make it make the historical connection between what happened with police violence and attitudes about race that were developed during slavery. So it's the timing of it seems to have fit the sort of national discussion that people were sort of having about the issue of race in the country.
Got it. And I know we're coming to the finish line here. It's almost 8:30, Professor. So I did want to ask you, I've heard it said once that American progress, at least in America, is similar to the beginning of the Christian Bible, where there was nothing but darkness. Especially as it comes to the advancement of specifically Black people in this country. And so, and then eventually there's more and more light, and more and more light, and more and more light, and more and more light. What gives you hope that the light is ultimately been, overtaking the darkness, and that it's the light that's been winning, over the course of since the inception of this country?
Well, I don't know that it's overtaking it. It's certainly lightening up, definitely. It has been getting better, but it's a process. It's forward and backlash, forward and backlash. What gives me hope is what I said before, is that we've been at this a long time, and it seems to be an inexhaustible resource. I mean, the determination to keep moving forward. And I just think we will continue to rise to the occasion. And that's I'm optimistic that every generation in its own way will continue to rise to the occasion. And if we think about moments like Juneteenth, where you have these people who are happy, but they know they're in for it. I mean, they know that they knew who they were living with, that this was not going to be an easy thing. And yet they went forward. In 1876, 4 Black men in Houston pool their resources and buy land for the specific purpose of celebrating Juneteenth, Emancipation Day, as it was still called then. And the park is still there. Emancipation Park is still there in Houston, and they still have events. And I've been to Emancipation Park. It's waxed and waned, but now in the past decade or so, it's been, a huge, events that take place there. So that kind of the lessons of the past give me faith in the future.
Well, final question for you before we cut out for the day. And thank you so much, because I know you are, 2 hours ahead or so?
3.
Oh, wow. So it's nearly tomorrow.
Almost midnight. Yes, nearly tomorrow.
So what are you going to be doing personally to celebrate Juneteenth on Saturday?
Well, one thing, I will be talking to a number of places, and I will try to find some red soda water. Okay. And I won't be able to barbecue because we live in an apartment, but I will have some Texas brisket in honor of Juneteenth and celebrate with my family.
All right. Well, if you want to send some of that up here. But seriously, Professor Gordon-Reed, it is an immense pleasure to speak with you today. And just thank you for all those who do not have this book. It should be required reading on Juneteenth. I cannot recommend it more highly. So just thank you again, Professor, for the privilege of your time today.
Thank you for inviting me. Have a good evening.
I want to thank both of you as well. And I want to thank the audience. Thanks for watching tonight, and thank you for your questions. Please purchase a copy of the book through the link in the chat. That's going to take you right over to Elliott Bay. And you can learn more about NAM's celebration of Juneteenth with the link in the chat as well. Thank you both so much for your discussion. I feel like I learned so much, and I hope that we can have you in person sometime soon, but stay safe and have a great night.
You too. Thank you. Good evening.